Everyone. All right, today is our final lecture, final comments. Obviously, this semester was not what any of us anticipated, and we had to cut off a number of topics and readings from our metaphysics syllabus. Nevertheless, I think we covered a lot of ground and got pretty deeply into the main issues of metaphysics. And in particular, I was happy to look at a couple of texts that I myself had never spent considerable time, Plotinus and the Schelling. So that was, I think, for me, really great, and thanks for bearing with me. Those were difficult texts. You all did really well with the Plotinus. The Schelling was very difficult. So, what can we say about metaphysics by way of conclusion? What is metaphysics? It's a question that doesn't really have a good answer. There are many, many books with the title, What is Metaphysics? It's a question that begins with Aristotle properly. Aristotle coined the term metaphysics. And I think, many philosophers would say metaphysics as such comes to an end in the 19th century. And so the Schelling essay that we just finished reading is one of the sort of, from one perspective, one of the final properly metaphysical essays and investigations and inquiries. So what is metaphysics? I mean, what's a sort of simple answer we can give? We can recall that the original meaning of metaphysics was simply that which is beyond physics or after physics. Metaphysics considers everything that is not contained within physics. So what is not contained within physics? What can't be answered through a study of the physical world alone? It would have to be the non-physical, right? And so metaphysics necessarily involves questions about the nature of thinking, the nature of spirit, of soul, and the nature, therefore, of God and good and evil. Metaphysics is the groundwork, traditionally speaking, for any kind of ethics, or for that matter, any other kind of philosophy. Right? Metaphysics is first philosophy. Metaphysics is the philosophy that tries to investigate the entirety of being. Right? As Aristotle defines it, metaphysics is the study of being, right? Where being would be understood to be greater than merely the physical world. And so, what does metaphysics study? What questions does metaphysics primarily seek to answer? I think a simple answer to that would be, as I've put it many times throughout the semester, metaphysics attempts to explain the relationship between thinking and the physical world, the relationship between an idea and an object. Right? Where do our ideas come from? how do our ideas connect to the physical world? Uh, and right, we saw many different answers to this question, but let's just sort of walk us back through what we've looked at over the course of the semester. We began at the very beginning, our first class, with a discussion of the pre-Socratic thinkers and the very first philosophers. And we began with Hesiod, right? The, uh, the Greek poet, uh, sort of complement to Homer, one of the primary sources for Greek religion and mythology, and Hesiod's Theogony, right, which describes the birth of the universe. And we've been returned to Hesiod in a nice, neat way through the Schelling essay, right, where Hesiod says the first, uh, the first God, the first existent is chaos, right? The yawning chasm, the gap, and that after chaos, we get two other figures introduced. We get Gaia, the earth, and Oranos, the sky, right? And we see through Hesiod's Theogony the way that the universe is brought into existence through the creation of pairs of opposites, earth and sky being one of those, but all of the other opposites as well, which preoccupy pre-Socratic philosophy, right? The opposition between hot and cold, wet and dry, uh, so on and so forth. The opposites that will continue to be problematic for thinking through the 19th century, as we see in Schelling and his analysis of the opposition between good and evil. Right, so Hesiod begins with chaos and then introduces a series of oppositions which constitute the makeup of existence, and then tells us that the sort of next wave of gods that are created, the first of them is love, right? And that love is a force that unifies these opposites. And this is an idea also that is reiterated, rearticulated in Schelling. So metaphysics, before it becomes metaphysics proper with Aristotle, is an inquiry into the nature of opposites, into the nature of being, and the two major pre-Socratic figures that we looked at, Heraclitus and Parmenides, both attempt to explain the nature of opposites through some conception of being as a whole, right? And we get two very different pictures of being as a whole in Heraclitus and Parmenides, right? For Heraclitus, the all, all that is, and that is sort of Heraclitus's technical term for being, the all. The all is organized according to the logos, right? According to the true account, right? Proper speech. All can be understood through good thinking, uh, good accounting, um, as it were. And yet, for Heraclitus, what the true account of nature, of being is a paradoxical, contradictory one, right? Uh, and this is summed up most pithily in the fragment of Heraclitus that reads, right, "We are and are not. Being is a kind of contradiction, a paradox, right? Um, being at variance with itself, it is unified." Another Heraclitean idea, right? The unity of the all is found in the manner in which it is uh, separated from itself. So already, um, you know, the very birth of Western philosophy, we have this problem of uh, sameness and difference, right? How do we account for uh, the unity of all things in being, and yet at the same time account for the absolute differentiation and change that is inherent to being in existence, right? How can all things be the same and yet all things also be different? Not just different from one another, but different from themselves, right? Constantly changing. For Heraclitus, this is the kind of mystery and paradox of being, and to grasp that paradox is what you get through the logos. Parmenides, and so if Heraclitus gives us a view of nature as essentially flux and change, differentiation, and that you know the unity of being is the universality of change, we get a very different picture from Parmenides. Right? Parmenides believes there is no change. That everything is always the same. Being is unchanging and constantly, eternally the same. So Heraclitus is a kind of primordial thinker of difference. Heraclitus is the most forceful thinker of sameness. Uh, so Parmenides gives us the idea that being is unchanging and that change is merely an illusion based on poor understanding, right? The opinion of mortals, and that were we to have a divine perspective, we would see that being is unchanging. Right? That is the story that is told in Parmenides' Proem. This idea that change is illusion, and that being is stable and unchanging and eternal is in many ways picked up and adapted by Plato with his theory of forms, right? The realm of appearances, the physical realm, is the realm of change, the realm of differentiation. The realm of truth and the true realm of being is the realm of forms, forms which are unchanging and always the same. And for Plato, it is the realm of forms, it is ideas that are the cause of the changing physical realm. Right? Now, Plato is, although he doesn't use the term metaphysics, this separation between the realm of forms and the realm of appearances will become the fundamental distinction of metaphysics, the sort of groundwork for all metaphysics thereafter. And right in our reading of Plotinus, we see the way that distinction between the realm of forms and the realm of appearances gets articulated in a way that can be adopted by Christian theology. And so this Platonic metaphysics becomes the groundwork also for a Christian metaphysics and Christian theology. Aristotle, who gives us the term metaphysics, is Plato's most powerful counterpoint and critic, right? Who argues that being, the true nature of being, doesn't lie just on one side of this division between forms and appearances, but a true being requires both form and material, physical being. Aristotle introduces the idea of substance, right? Right, an idea that comes to be translated in Latin as substance, but as we should recall, the word that Aristotle really uses is ousia, which simply means being. And for Aristotle, this being, this substance, is our proper being, the proper being of an individual, which is a combination of matter and form, and the true substance or ousia of the thing, of any body or individual, is its trajectory, its entelechy, its development toward a flourish. Plotinus, we saw a key argument that Plotinus makes is against one of Aristotle's critiques of Plato. Right? Aristotle says one of the major problems with Plato's theory of forms, and one of the reasons why we have to include matter in the nature of a being's true nature, of its true being, is because if we say that the true being of an individual lies, my being, my proper being, is identical to your proper being, to account for difference. Dichotomy between sameness and difference. Aristotle is trying to account for difference more than Plato does. And for Plotinus, this is essentially not a problem. For Plotinus, it is acceptable that human beings should all have the same form. That which separates us as individuals is not, in fact, part of our true being. Our individuality is not important. In order for us to become what we most essentially are, we have to turn away from our individuality, our physical embodiment to the greatest extent possible. And we do that by focusing on the part of our being, our soul, which is directly connected to God. Right? And that direct connection comes through emanation. The key idea of Plotinus is this idea of emanation, which we've been over several times. But the idea is essentially everything emanates from God. Everything emanates from the One, and therefore, insofar as anything in the physical world has true being, that being is derived from the One, and all being is, in truth, in absolute unity. Uh, Emanation, however, is this going forth from God as energy goes forth from the sun. And in that process of going forth, the perfection and the unity of God deteriorates. It goes through a process of degradation. And that degradation has leads to individuation and the physical embodiment of form. Right? Embodiment is the consequence of God's goodness degrading as it emanates from Him. So that is the sort of answer that Plotinus gives to Aristotle. I mean, one of them, and we go through that in much more detail in the lectures on Plotinus. But the reason I wanted to bring in Plotinus is I think it's interesting to see how that Platonic metaphysics gets adapted for a sort of Christian worldview, right? And what Plato calls education, right? Which is learning to not believe in the physical world, but to believe instead in the forms that are the cause of and the organizing principle of the physical world. Right? That is the process of education for Plato. For Plotinus, there is no right way that you can find the seeds of truth in the physical world. Physical world is evil, right? Matter is evil. And so what is analogous to education and knowledge for in Plato, for Plotinus, is this idea instead of purifaction, which is a complete turning away from the physical world, a turning inward, and a kind of asceticism whereby you gain knowledge only by inner reflection and on reflection on your pure connection to God through your soul. So the big sort of change from Plato to Plotinus is in the way the physical world is viewed. Right? The physical world becomes not just false and illusory, but evil. And it's very interesting the extent to which Schelling, in his essay, is responding to Plotinus's idea of good and evil, right? And I think, after I finished reading the Schelling essay, I went back and read the first couple verses of Genesis. And it's, which is, a text I'm not terribly familiar with, in fact. But it's striking how similar Schelling's story about the beginning of the universe, the beginning of existence, resembles and is a kind of exegesis of the creation story in Genesis. I think what Schelling is doing, the reason why he is preoccupied with Plotinus's concept of good and evil is that, well, on the one hand, he thinks that Plotinus doesn't give a sufficient account of freedom, but he's also thinking about uh, a way of interpreting the um, story of creation in Genesis uh, that will, and thus Christian theology, that will be different than this one we get from Plotinus, kind of emendation to Plotinus's view. In any case, that's a rabbit hole. We then made a big jump from Plotinus to the beginning of modernity and Rene Descartes and the Meditations and Descartes' cogito, the I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. And we discussed the way that with Descartes and modernity, truth and being become grounded in the ego, right? The ego cogito ergo sum, in the I think, in the thinking subject. And the thinking subject becomes the ground of truth and being, and everything is based on that, right? For Descartes, I need to prove my own existence before I can prove the existence of God or the existence of the external world. And it's precisely this modern innovation, you might say, of Descartes, grounding being in the I think, that Schelling has in mind when he talks about the human error of trying to make humanity the centrum, the ground of being, rather than God, right? So when Schelling is talking about the evil of human being, that it comes from the human ability to be to posit itself as the center of being. He has Descartes in mind. But with Descartes, we get a number of other problems, most notably the mind-body problem, which is a kind of species of the Platonic metaphysical distinction between form and appearance, but recast. And now it is a separation between thinking and sensory experience. How do my thoughts relate to my sensory experience? Everything is filtered through the I. Everything is filtered through the ego, through my own experience, through the human subject. And this is the mind-body problem. How is my mind connected to my body? Right, the fact that I'm thinking does not prove that I have a body. And Descartes spends the rest of the meditations trying to prove the existence of the external world and his own body. I won't go through Descartes' proof of God again, except to say that for Descartes, God is also transformed. God becomes synonymous with truth and synonymous with nature as it can be known clearly and distinctly, which is to say, God is the necessary laws of nature. God and nature become one in Descartes. And this is also one of the things that Schelling wants to argue against, right? That Descartes, that God can't simply be um, a perfect set of rules. For Descartes, God becomes little more than a logical system. And for Schelling, this is inadequate. It doesn't allow for an adequate conception of God or nature or the human being. Right? Schelling wants to reintroduce the idea of a living God and a human being that is whose essence lies in life, not just in thinking. Um, and what follows from Descartes, in terms of a history of philosophy, is then this long-standing debate from the 17th century to for the next 200 years after Descartes, uh, between rationalists and empiricists. And unfortunately, we didn't get as deep into that debate as we might have. We didn't read any of the good empiricists, which was unfortunate. Generally, we read David Hume or John Locke. But we did look at Leibniz, and I gave a brief synopsis of Spinoza also. Right? And in both Leibniz and Spinoza, we get different views of this Cartesian idea that God is a system of nature, in essence, and thus different views of determinism. And determinism, which can be related back also to Parmenides, the thought that everything that happens according to necessary laws, that everything is a consequence of the first cause, and everything unfolds through this chain of cause and effect that is unchangeable. Right? So everything is predetermined. And this also is one of the major arguments that Schelling wants to make, right? That determinism is false, right? That there is room for freedom as well as natural laws. And to try and make that argument that human freedom and the laws of nature are not mutually exclusive is perhaps the most difficult argument that you can make or attempt to make in philosophy. I'm not sure I did Schelling's account of that possibility justice, but in essence, it's going to be that human freedom lies outside of time, that all freedom lies outside of time and therefore outside of determination, that in the moment where the human is free, it is able to step outside of that chain of causes, go back to the very beginning of existence and being, and ground itself, become a self-caused being, which would be able to interrupt that chain of causes, be able to add to that chain of causes, right, to contribute to it. Now, the debate between determinism and freedom and Schelling's response to this debate has a lot to do with Immanuel Kant. Right? And we saw just a little bit of Kant's metaphysics. Kant's metaphysics really require their own semester to truly understand. But we looked at what I think is the most interesting and provocative section of his most important book, um, The Critique of Pure Reason. We looked at the Transcendental Aesthetic, where he argues that space and time are forms of intuition that belong to our subjectivity and do not exist in the external world as themselves. Now, for Kant, we don't see the world as it exists in itself. We don't experience things in themselves, as he says. We experience things as they are given to us in the manner that we are capable of experiencing them. And right, the possibility of experience comes, or rather, experience is made possible by a set of conditions. Kant talks about the condition for the possibility of experience. And those conditions would include the form of my sensibility, right, my five senses. I'm only able to experience as much of the world as my five senses are able to receive. I can't say what a thing in itself is. I can only say what my five senses are able to pick up about that thing. The other condition for experience are these aesthetic intuitions, intuitions of space and time, which are not empirical. I never have a sensory experience of space and time. They are intuitions, right? They are my sort of innate, intuitive ability to receive the world. They lie on the side of the subject. And then the third kind of condition for Kant that will make experience possible are the a priori ideas, right? Innate ideas that I project onto the sensory data I receive in order to organize that sensory data and make it make sense. Now, the way this connects to Schelling is with the idea that the world of experience, nature, follows laws, yes, but the laws of nature and the nature that we experience, the nature that we say exists, is not nature in itself, but only nature as we experience it, which leaves room for a realm of being which exists beyond our capacity for experience. That opens up right, what Kant calls the noumenal realm. And I think that idea is in play when Schelling conceives of God as something that is more than merely an existence. And it makes it conceivable that the human being would also be more than just its existence in the physical world, which is dictated by necessary laws. The human being would have one foot, so to speak, in a realm that is not governed by those necessary laws. And it would be through our commerce with that uh, non physical, noumenal realm that we might find our freedom and be able to interrupt that chain of causes to act as a cause in ourselves. Uh, so that's my brief overview of our whole semester. Uh, there are several papers that we didn't get to look at. They're on the original syllabus. If you're interested, I recommend taking a look at those, especially if you're interested in the mind-body problem uh, or the Kantian question of the conditionality of experience. I recommend looking at John Searle's essay, Can Computers Think? And Thomas Nagel's essay, What's It Like to Be a Bat? For those of you who are interested in, those are both 20th century essays that are about the nature of the relation between bodies and thoughts, the mind-body problem, and the limits of human subjectivity. Both very interesting. Now, I mean, by way of conclusion, why study metaphysics? Why care about metaphysics? It might be that the best answer is silence, in some sense. Whether or not metaphysics is still a viable philosophical study is debated. But I think reading metaphysics, reading the history of metaphysics, is at least valuable in that it is an exercise in rigorously examining foundational ideas of any kind of thinking or belief. Thinking about metaphysics is a way to think about what truth might be. We still very much live in a Cartesian world where truth is certainty, where nature is that which can be observed and understood through some kind of scientific method, where the thinking subject is the ground of experience, and where the human being is understood as in essence. And sorry, I think I just lost my connection, but we're back. And so to study the history of metaphysics is, at the very least, a way of getting tools to challenge about truth and reality that are still very much accepted and even presupposed today. Maybe not in the halls of academia, but in real life. And I think about any kind of totalizing worldview, that being is more than simply the physical world, but that being, whatever it is continuously mysterious. Kind of trite, but true. Trite and true. The history of metaphysics. All right, guys. Well, thanks for a good semester. I'll write an email. I finished reading all your papers. All right. Have a good summer. Good luck managing all this madness. I hope you're all holding up. All right.